Hey guys, this is Tech Howdy. I welcome you to another video tutorial where we are building this CMS application using Angular 10 and ASP.NET Core 3. In the past couple of videos that we have worked on, we are working on the authentication part of this admin panel. We have finished working on the cookie service. We do have some methods that we will implement in the upcoming videos, but they are not needed at this point. We will also work on the other functionalities of the app user, that's our client app user, but right now we are just focused on the admin panel and the admin user. So we have finished working on the authentication service and the required method for the admin user to log in and the tokens being generated. Now in the last video tutorial, we finished working on this login method. Now let's also create a logout method that can be used when the user wants to log out. They can click the logout button and all the associated cookies that we have created in the browser will be deleted, and the token that we have generated and stored in the token table, also we will delete that token from the table. So let's quickly go ahead and create this HTTP post method. So here I'm going to add another HTTP post method. This method will be of type action result. IAction result, it's a task and it's an asynchronous task where we are first trying to get the cookie from the user's browser through the cookie service that we have created. Now in the cookie service, we have a get method where we have to provide the name of the cookie that we need to fetch. Now here, while logging in, we have already set this cookie, so there should be a cookie inside the logout request that is coming in. Now we are creating an instance of the provider, so we need to get the data protection interface. We have already added instantiated the provider in the constructor. Here we need to also add a reference to dependency ingestion extensions of Microsoft. So I'm going to add that here. By doing this, I will no longer see the error related to iData protection. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm trying to get the iData protection service. I'm trying to create a protector from the uh, key that I have stored in the app settings file. So if you have not watched the previous video tutorial where we are creating the token and encrypting the token and the cookies, I recommend you to watch that. I will not explain in detail that what and how we are decrypting this, because we have already encrypted these cookies using the key that we have stored inside the app settings file, and we are using the same key to decrypt the cookie in layer 1 of decryption, because the user ID is only encrypted in one stage. We don't have two layers of encryption on the user ID, and that's precisely the reason why we just put only one layer, because we want to use the user ID in many places. Now we have decrypted it using the application user key that we have. Now we will unprotect the user ID, and now we have the user ID of ID of the user in this particular variable called as unprotected token. Now since we have the user ID, using some entity framework query, we will go ahead and try to get the user from our DB set. And when we have the user, we will make sure we remove any tokens associated with that user in the table. We'll save the changes, and finally we will delete all cookies. We have already created this method for deleting all cookies in the last video tutorial. We have to provide a collection of all the cookies that we want to delete. So I have already created this collection here with the names of the cookies in the collection. So the each cookie with the following names will be deleted. Please watch the last video tutorial how we created this method. You will understand it. So that's all. Once we delete the cookies, the user will be logged out because they don't have a cookie in the browser. They cannot make any requests to view the protected views in our application. And if there is any exception for some reason, I will still delete all the cookies, but which also means that we were not able to delete the token because there was some kind of exception. And we have already set a method in the uh, auth service. If we are not able to delete the token, what happens? Therefore, that's the reason why we are first checking if there are any old tokens. We delete the old tokens before adding new tokens. So now you will understand why we added this method to check for old tokens in the auth method of our authentication service. So That is it for deleting the cookies and logging out the user. Now I'm creating an extension method. After the user has been logged out, I want to redirect the user to a particular view. So let's create a redirect method over here. This will be a private method because this is only going to be accessed by this class. So I'm just going to create this extension method redirect to local inside this particular class. So here at the bottom, I'll place this redirect to local method. I'm passing the parameter as null, which means that uh, if the value is null, we will redirect the user to uh, the home page or the home controller to the index view of the home controller. Now what will happen is when the user is redirected to the home page without the cookie, the user will be redirected to the access denied or login page, whatever we have set for the redirect, because they don't have a cookie. Okay, so once the user logs out, we will call this method, and when the user is redirected to the home page without the cookie, the user cannot access that path, as we know, because they don't have a cookie. So that should be it for this particular class for controller. We don't need anything else in this method. So this controller class is basically completed for our account controller. If there's anything that we need to add or delete, we can do that later. Only thing that we want to do is work on the dependencies. Now what I mean by work on dependencies is, if you notice all the projects that we created for this authentication part, starting with activity service, starting with cookie service. So here we are instantiating all these objects in the controller as well, and these are dependencies that are going to be injected from the pipeline of our application. So we need to make sure that all these dependencies that we are injecting are available to inject during runtime. So if I go to the startup class, we need to make sure all these services have been instantiated or injected here in the pipeline. So let's go ahead and add all the services that we require to be injected so that we don't get any errors when we run the application. So the first thing that we need to add in the startup class or in the pipeline of our application is the authentication handler or the authentication options that we created to authenticate the admin. And we need to do that in the startup class, because when we go to the home page of our application for the admin panel, so if I go to areas, admin, controllers, and the home controller, here we are using the authentication scheme admin in the attribute of this method. So that means this needs to be available at runtime. This service needs to be available at runtime. So I need to go to startup class and make sure that this service is instantiated here. So I can add this service. I can create a comment here saying authentication scheme service, and all the authentication schemes, I will put them under this particular comment. So here I'm adding the services dot calling the add authentication method, and I'm specifying the name of the authentication scheme, and then I'm providing the classes and the interface or the classes associated with the authentication scheme. I have to provide the options class and the handler class that I have created. I have to add the missing references. So here it will ask me to add the missing references or create the class. Now, since I have not yet referenced this project, which is the filters project that we created, filter service project. So let's go ahead and add this as a reference to our main project. So here I add the filter service and I click OK. Now the package is being restored. Once the package is restored, I will be able to add the references, or basically add the import statements in this class. So the packages were successfully restored. Let's hover over these classes, and now I should be able to see the missing import statement, which is using filter service. Let's go ahead and add it, and now I don't see any errors. Now the next thing that we need to add in the pipeline, let's go to the account controller. Here we are using the cookie service. So let's go ahead and add the cookie service. So here in the startup class, just above the authentication scheme, I will add the cookie helper service. I will add services.add HTTP context accessor, and I have made use of this HTTP context accessor in the cookie service. So if you haven't watched that video tutorial, go ahead and watch it. Now going back to the startup class, we also want to add the cookie options, which is a part of Microsoft ASP.NET Core HTTP. So let's add the import statement. And now we also need to add the import statement for our project cookie service so that we can access this. So using cookie service, we will add this, and now here the errors have disappeared. So we have successfully added the service to the pipeline. Now let's look at what's next that we need to add. So we have created the activity service and the auth service. We have not yet implemented the methods for the activity service, but we'll go ahead and let's add the references here in the startup class. So the services are instantiated for us. So I've added the auth service and the activity service as a transient service, which means that for every new request, the service will be instantiated. So let's go ahead and add the reference to auth service, and also go ahead and add the reference to IActivityService and activity class. Sorry, IActivityService and activity service class. So now the thing here would be that in our activity service class that we have over here, we are getting this error. We need to work on this class. We need to specify that this class that's from IActivityService. Let's save this and let's go back to our startup class, and now we should get rid of this error. We will work on these activity service and the required methods. So for now, let's just add the service in the pipeline. Now let's look at what else we need to add. If we go back to the account controller, we are using AppSettings and we are instantiating it in the controller. So we need to make sure that the app settings is also available during runtime. So let's go ahead and add it. So I'll add it here just below or just above the auth service. So here I have added the app settings service. I got the app settings service from the app settings file, and the way we get it using the configuration.get section, and we are getting the app settings section. Uh, the next thing that we would need to add after the app settings service is the JWT authentication service, is our authentication service, and the authentication schema for the JWT token. So in our authentication service here, we are going to get we are validating the tokens, and when the tokens are being created, we need to make sure that the authentication schema has been implemented in our project. So if we go to the startup class, we need to implement that authentication schema. So let's go ahead and implement it over here. So here we will add the JWT authentication schema, and here we need to make sure we add the authentication package for JWT bearer tokens in our project. So let's go to the main project and then add the NuGet package that we need. So we are going to add the package called as ASP.NET Core.authentication.jwt bearer. So we will search it and then we will add it to our project, Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.authentication.jwt bearer. We will install the latest stable version because we are using JWT authentication or JWT token in our project. We need to add this so that we can define the bearer authentication scheme, how you want the tokens to be created, with what properties and so on. We need this particular class or package. So let's add this package. Let's accept the required conditions and then add the package. Now the package is being installed. So the package is installed. If we can open up the dependencies for our project, go to NuGet and check, yes, the JWT bearer package is now installed. Now the next thing that we want to do is go ahead and add the import statement using Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.authentication.jwt bearer. This will remove all the errors. Also, now for the token validation parameters, we need to add reference to Microsoft identity model.tokens. Let's add that. And now finally for encoding, we need to add reference to system.text. So let's add that as well. So now here we are defining the uh, authentication scheme for the JWT bearer tokens. So what is going to be the sign-in key, how you want to validate the tokens, do you want the issuer to be validated. So these all values that you are setting here, the values are stored in your app settings file under this section, which is called as app settings. Therefore, we are getting this app settings section first, mapping over the values from app settings to the app settings class, and then using them to assign that values to our token validation parameters. It's the same thing that we did in the auth service as well when we created the tokens. If you look at this, so you will in the tokens where we created the tokens and we decrypted the tokens. I'm sorry, not in the auth service, but in the admin authentication handler. Here, when we are validating the tokens, we are validating the tokens against the same parameters. Therefore, when the request for the token comes in, or when we are validating the token in the request of our pipeline, we are checking all these values here. So we need to define this schema, make sure it's same. And here there is a value which you'll see time span dot zero for clock skew, which means now when we generate tokens for JWT using this package, the default expiry time for a token is 5 minutes. But if you don't want the default expiry time to be 5 minutes and you want the default expiry time to be like 0, so when a token is generated, you want the expiry time to be set by the admin or by your application, not by uh, the package that we are using, which, as I mentioned, the default time is 5 minutes. So you can set that value or update that value by setting the time span dot zero over here, the property value for clock skew. So that's all it for the JWT authentication service. Now this service will be available in the pipeline, and when we inject and request this service, it will be available to the class that is requesting it. Now let's look at what else we need to inject in the startup class. So one important service that we need would be the data protection service, because we are using this data protection service to decrypt and encrypt the uh, tokens. So if we search for data protection, we have used it in many classes and we have injected it, and we are using this data protection service to create and encrypt our tokens. So data protection over here. So you can see at step 4 as well, we are creating in the admin authentication handler, we are creating we are trying to get a service called as iData Protection Provider. This is part of Microsoft's ASP.NET Core data protection class, and this helps us to encrypt the tokens or encrypt the data in your application. But when the provider tries to get this service from the startup class, and if the service is not being injected in the pipeline, we will get an error. So let's add this service. So I'm just going to add this service here about app settings service section that I created. So I'm going to get the section values from app settings file for data protection keys, and then map over the values to the class that we have created, which is the data protection keys class in our model service. And now what we want to do over here is add it as a service so we can access it. Now finally what we want to do is add the Microsoft data protection service, inject it, and we need to specify to persist the keys in the DB context. So if we don't do this, what will happen? The keys will be persisted inside the memory of your application. So if you're deploying this application to a different server or on multiple servers, you will have issues because the key generated on one machine will not work on the other machine. Therefore, we are saving or persisting these keys in this context, which is the data protection keys context that we have created initially when we worked on the database. So we have already created this database over here and added the connection to the under the DB connection option. So you can find it here. So now what we do is we will add the missing reference to ASP.NET Core data protection, and that should be it for our data protection service. Now it's available to be consumed and be injected. So pretty much everything that we need is being added to the pipeline. The only thing that we need to work on now is the activity service, and the activity service we don't need too many classes here. We just need methods that are going to add the activity to the activity table that we will create in our database. So we don't need to delete any activity. Only thing we want to do is get the user's activity. So let's work on it quickly and add this activity service. So I'm just going to need an instance of application DB context, because in the application DB context we can communicate with our database. Here we will add the reference to our project data service. So let's go ahead, add the reference to data service, and also add reference to logging so we can log any errors. That should be it in references. So let's click OK. We might also need model service. So let's go ahead and create any models that we would need. So we would need a activity model, so to structure the activities. So let's go ahead and add this activity model over here. So I'm going to call this activity model. So let's go ahead and add the activity model. We don't need a constructor in the model class. All we need is the following properties. So I'll add the reference to data annotations because I'm using the key attribute and specifying that this is the primary key of this particular table. Here I've added the properties type for the type of the activity, IP address. The IP address is the user's IP address, the location. If we can fetch the location of the user, we will do that using the cookie service. The three methods that we have not implemented in the cookie service, they will be useful to do this, to get this information. The operating system as well. So now the date and time when the activity took place, the user's ID, and the color, and the icon. The icon is basically the font or some icon. I will show you how to use it, but for now let's go ahead and create this activity model, and we need to add this activity model in our data service application DB context class so that we can create the table using entity framework. So here we need to add a class for activity model. So I'm going to call this activities because this is a table that holds all the activities. So I mostly use plural naming conventions for the DB sets. So activities will hold all the activities. So now we have added this. Now let's go back to the activity service class, and here let's go ahead and import the reference to data service and instantiate our application DB context in the constructor. So now let's go ahead and add the required methods that we would need in the activity service. So here for the user activity, we just need two methods. One, to add the user activity. Second, to get the user activity. We don't delete any user activity. Okay, so let's go ahead and add the import statement to system.threading.tasks so that we can run this method or call this method asynchronously. We will, when we get the user activity, we return a list of activities. So we need to add to system generic collections. So model service and system dot generic collections, add the import statement. Also we would need to add these methods in our activity service interface so we have access to them. We will add the import statement, and let's go back to the activity service and get this method as well. And add the import statement. Now that should be it. So let's close the interface. We don't need it anymore open. So let's go ahead and quickly work on the activity add user activity method. As we always do, we will wrap everything in try catch block and we will log the exception. Let's add the import reference to our logging service, which I forgot to do. Oh, it's already done in the activity service. Okay, so I just need to import Serilog and that should be it. The next thing that I want to do is go ahead and try to get the user's information. So I'm going to use a using statement to create a scope. So let's add a using statement here and begin the transaction scope. So you can, this is basically a short form to use the using statement. You can also use the using statement like this and put your code inside these code block, or you can just do it the way I did it. It's a short form to do this. So I mean, however you prefer. So I'm going to create, I'm going to begin the transaction, and then I need to make sure that once the transaction is created, I go ahead and add the users. So let's go ahead and add them. Add the user activity. So to add the user activity, just 3 lines of code. First, we will add the activity. So the activity model will contain all the information related to the activity. We will save the transaction and then we will commit the transaction. If anything goes back, we can roll the transaction. So, okay, one mistake here, sorry for that. I need to put this outside the try block so that I can have access to the DB context transaction. So I'm just going to, if there's any error, I'm just going to await and then DB context transaction dot, I will call the rollback async method. So any changes will be rollback, simple as that. So that should be it. So that's the add user activity. This method is complete. We are just adding the activity, nothing complicated there. And then finally, we are going to get a list of user activities if the user has any activities. So let's go ahead and get the list of that user's activities. So here under the get user activity, first we create a list that will hold all the activities. Then we do a transaction on the database where we will call the activities, and inside the activities DB set, we will search for all user activities where the user ID matches the user ID that we have provided in the parameter of the function. So if the user ID exists, then we will grab all the activities related to that user and then we will put it in a list. Now we are going to mention that how much activity we want to show in the user activity view. What I mean is, if the user has 10,000 activities because the user has used your application for more than a year, then obviously we are not going to fetch all 10,000, right? So we want to only show the last 10 or 20 activities of the user. We will implement that logic, but for now, if you want to implement the limit over here, you can implement it here. But if you don't want to implement the limit over here, I'm going to implement the limit in the user activity view, but we can also implement it over here. We don't need it. For now, let's leave it like this and implement using system.link because we are calling the where method, and the toList method async, we need to reference the entity framework core import statement over here. So that should be it. So we got the list, we save it to user activities and we return it. If there's no activities, we will just return an empty list. So that should be it. So these two methods done, activity service is also completed. We have implemented the activity service in the startup class. So it's available to all other classes. So we are done with that. Home controller, back to the home controller. In the home controller, we have a lot of things to do, but we will first go ahead and test our application before we implement the features in the home controller. Because when the admin logs in, we need to show them a dashboard. They need to have access to the application settings and so on, which we can do in the upcoming videos. So for this video tutorial, that should be it, where we implemented the activity service. We implemented all the required classes in the pipeline. We injected them. So now all that we need to do is go ahead and test the application. So let's go ahead and build the application first of all to make sure that we don't get any errors. So I'm going to build this CMS core_ng application. Now, before we run this application, there's one important thing that we need to do, which is here in the application DB context, we have defined certain DB sets. Although we have only created two tables in our application for application users and addresses. We have not created these two tables for tokens and activities, right? So we can do this two ways. We can run the migrations command from entity framework to create this, but we don't have any data as of yet in our application. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to go to the uh, application DB context class and make sure that I create this. But before that, let me just see, I don't have any errors. It's just warnings that I see that I have not used certain methods, but that's okay. So let's do the migrations. So first, let me just go and delete this migrations folder. Pay attention over here that I'm deleting this migration folder, but I'm going to create it again. Now I'll delete this migrations folder from this application. Now the next step, as you know, in the data service of our application, if you have not watched the entity framework core tutorial that where we created the database, you should watch it, because we have the method or the logic implemented where we are checking if the database doesn't exist, doesn't have any users, we are recreating it, right? So now we have deleted the database. Now I need to go ahead and run the migrations command. So I'll just go ahead and build this application once again before I run the migrations command. So build was successful. I will open the project and go to the tools and go to the open the project in terminal. Now I need to run some migration commands. So let me expand this window, and then I need to do .NET EF migrations add. I will name this migration as initial create. Because I deleted the old migration, I can name this as initial create. And I'm going to specify the context name. So its context is application DB context. So just make sure you name your application DB context. So let's go ahead and hit enter. Oh, one more important thing, that make sure that your database is running. As of now, if I go to Kitematic, my database is running, so I shouldn't get any errors. If your database is not running, you will definitely get an error. So in order to create the migrations, you need to make sure that your server is running and your database, not your database, but your server is running, because we are going to create the database. So so the migrations for application DB context is created. So let's go ahead and check. Yes, the migration folder is recreated. If we open it, we have application DB context and we have the migrations file, which contains all the migrations to create the required tables. Okay, so fine, that's good. Now let's close this, and we need to also run another migration command because we have two contexts. We have the data protection key context as well. So I'm just going to run the command, but just change the context name to data protection keys. context. So now let's go ahead and hit enter, and now the migration for data protection keys context will also be created. Now that's it. We don't need to run the update database command to create the tables or the database, because when we run this application it should be done. So if we open the uh, Azure Data Studio and we connect to our database, so let's connect to our database. So let me connect here, let me click on this, and let me do docker SQL123, hit enter. I'm logged in now in my database, CMS underscore core underscore ng. Now I have to delete this database, this old database that's there. So I'm going to run this command. So let me close this. So make sure you delete the old database before you run the application. Otherwise you will get an error because a database with that name already exists. So I need to go ahead and delete these two databases. So I'm going to right click on the data on the localhost and open a new query window, and then I'm going to run this command, which is drop database data protection key context and drop database cms core ng underscore dev. I'm going to press F5, run the command. Now the command was executed successfully. Let's refresh the database, and I shouldn't have these databases anymore. Now let's go ahead and run our application. So the application is running now. As we have implemented, when the application runs, the database should be created or initialized. If I go back to the Azure Data Studio, and now let's try to refresh the database. So I don't have any database created. That means there is some error in our application while running these migrations. So no worries, we go back to the application. This is precisely the reason why we have a logging service which logs any kind of errors that we are logging related to our application. So where do we look for these problems? We are going to debug. So let's go to the logs folder. There is a log file created with today's date. So I'm going to open it, and here there is a log. So let's go ahead and go through the log files. So here the first line of the log says error, one or more errors occurred, login failed for the user. Now why can a login fail? There can be so many reasons. Either the database is the server is not running up and running, but in my case the server is up and running, which I already mentioned. So has to do something with the password. So let's see, it says SQL credentials fail. So let's go ahead and check the app settings files which contains the password for the server. So if I go to the app settings.json file, here is the problem because I did not update the password. So I need to change the password to docker SQL123, since I had changed it to your DB user password. So whoever downloads this particular file understands that from the DevOps repo, when they download this file, they understand that they have to use their own password, not the password that I'm using here. So I need to change this to my Docker password. So now I need to stop this and now try to rebuild this application and then run it again. And at this point everything should work as expected. So guys, this is one good thing that you guys also are aware how to go and check the logs. So if your application has some problem like this, go check the logs, because that's the reason why we implemented the logging service at the very beginning of this project or video tutorial, so that we can catch these kinds of errors. So now let's go ahead and run this application. Let's see if at this time if we see any errors. So looks like everything is fine now. I can see it in the terminal window because we are also outputting the logs onto the console or the terminal window using the custom console from Serilog that we created. So you guys can watch that video as well. It's a part of this video tutorial series. So now the application is up and running. If I go back to Azure Data Studio, now I refresh. So now our database is created. So the issue was just with the password. So now we should have the tokens, and we should also have the activities table created, as a part of our migrations. So that should be it for this video tutorial, because the video tutorial is quite lengthy now. In the next video tutorial, we will start working on the login, test the login admin view, and we will also work on our login form so we can consume all the classes or services that we created. It's going to be exciting. So please do follow us, like and subscribe us so that we can bring you such content. And if you have any questions, use the comment sections. Note that all the code is available for free and it's in the DevOps repo. You can find the link in the video description. Thank you once again.